Welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we're talking with Treena Reilkoff, and we are talking about turning trauma into a resilient asset. Treena, great first and second segment there. Lots of interesting points, and it's nice. I'm actually getting to share some of the things that are happening in my life and uh, things that I'm seeing as well. However, I'm wondering for people that maybe are having some challenges, what can they do? What can any of us do to help improve our situation and deal with trauma and become more resilient?
Yeah. Well, when I think of that question, what comes to mind is during the period of COVID and when it just kind of started opening up again. I remember I literally woke up on a Sunday in the summer, and the thought that popped in first thing in my mind was, why do I believe in the human capacity of resiliency so much? Like, why? Where does this come from? Right? I've had experiences, but where? And I think I was listening to a Brene Brown podcast and somebody else, and it was kind of like that idea of the term vulnerability, right? Where vulnerability used to be a very, bad word. It was associated with being weak and distance somebody and you're not supported, don't associate with that person, it was all negative connotations. But when you actually think vulnerability is a strength. So I woke up that morning going, if I truly believe in resiliency and the power of the human capacity to be resilient after any conflict, adversity, critical incident, or trauma, I need to be totally vulnerable to somebody. So that morning, that Sunday, I always go to my neighbors for coffee. And I said, I'm creating a list of all the experiences in my life that I can recall that I deemed as traumatic, high conflict, stressful, adverse. And I put them in categories of personal, professional, and environmental. And so I was going to just read this list, be vulnerable to my girlfriend, read this list, and I trust her 100%, right? And you have to have that trust in somebody to be able to be that vulnerable. And I just wanted to see what one word or two words of what she thought first comes to mind, just out of curiosity. By chance, when I went to go for coffee, her boyfriend was over, and so was another good friend of ours. And I was like, I can either bail or I'm going to be vulnerable amongst two other people. And I'm like, I'm doing this. I really believe in it. Vulnerability is a strength. So I read my lists. And my one friend, he's like, his mouth dropped open and he went, wow. The other one said, you're bleep, 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 which I knew was going to come out of his mouth. And I just started laughing. And then my girlfriend goes, she didn't have a comment to that. She goes, you read that like a grocery list. And that kind of stuck because what helped me cope with any potential traumatic response of a fight, flight, fawn, or freeze and get a visceral somatic response, even though cognitively I'm present and I know what I'm doing, but my body still might react. I presented it as a grocery list in how I named everything with no emotional response and kind of coming from the clinical experience. When you have a traumatic response and you go through counseling and trying to manage those responses, the healing comes when you can share the story and you no longer get any visceral response, that tightness, that, choking feeling, the
Yeah.
sweating, the shaking, right? So I was able to share everything. And just like to give a context, right? I talked about my stalking incident, but in my life, I've been stalked 3 times, right?
My
For
goodness.
personal. When you look at, I've gone through divorce. That's personal. Professional, right? First job ever was a psychiatric institution. So from 16 to 19, I was exposed to having bodily fluids thrown at me, kicked, punched, choked, scratched, called everything. But it was also in an environment where I understood the developmental disabilities from birth, and the situations was don't take it personal, right? So I didn't take it personal. I understood the environment. I worked in the environment, got exposed to a lot, but I think that helped me build my tolerance and acceptance of all people. So that's kind of like personal. And then environmental, I've lived through, the snowstorms because I've lived in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, now Ontario. I've lived through the lightning storms, the tornadoes. I experienced 2 earthquakes living on Vancouver Island, where every other environmental, disaster or storm, living, even if it's a little earthquake, that feeling of you're trapped, and unless you have that helicopter in your backyard, you feel hopeless, helpless, right? So it's how I got through those. Like I got stalked by a cougar, which was really interesting. Luckily, I had three Rottweiler dogs with me in the bushes, the forest, deep forest on Vancouver Island by where I lived, right? So I wrote them all down, and then I used my list of resilient traits that I know, and I wrote down the incident. I wrote down how I dealt with it. I then listed the traits of how I dealt with it. And then I wrote beside it, what did I learn from it that made me stronger because I got through it and I'm here today. So every time you do get through an incident, no matter how stressful, traumatic, there's still another day and you've gotten through it because you're here today. And it might be tough and you might be at your lowest point, but have belief in yourself because you do have the strengths and the abilities within you. Sometimes we just have to remind ourselves, and that's where that move from SOS to SRSR. We are our greatest strength. We have self-reflection from our past experiences. You go in the workplace trauma, workplace violence, harassment, conflict. The leaders, the employees, you are the solutions. Give people a chance to create their own solutions, bring forward the problems, but have the solutions because that's where the creativity and the ability to grow is, to mitigate the risk.
Would you recommend that people do that writing? I'll call it a writing exercise.
Yeah. It's
Because as you were talking, I thought that could be something that benefits people that we talked about earlier on that, may not seem as though they're learning or anything, or maybe have low self-esteem. But if they write it all down and they go through this, it could actually really boost them and move them from that, as you had it, SOS to SRSR.
Yeah, well, writing it down, it is narrative therapy is what it's called. So when you do write out, whether you journal, or write stories, it is cathartic and it is a modality of therapy that helps address the stressors in you, right? So that's why they say, before you go to sleep, write everything out that's in your mind if you can't stop thinking, right? There's something neurologically that happens that when you write it out, you get it out. And like another tool, like for anger management, when I used to do counseling, it's cathartic and it's therapeutic when you're angry, or I was in a real bad car accident in my early 20s. So I journaled all my anger, frustration, everything, and then I tore it up because it was a process to help get rid of it and get it out. So it's called narrative therapy. How you choose to write it out, whether journaling, letter to yourself, a flow chart, checky box, there's no right or wrong. It's finding
Right.
what works for you.
What would you suggest if there are people that um, are in the SOS side of things? What's one of the first things you would recommend them do?
Well, if you're in the SOS, go seek medical attention, mental health support, right? And that's kind of where, again, that vulnerability, that idea of seeking help makes you weak. Kind of reframe it and looking at, if you are in crisis, call the crisis line. They're unbiased people there to help you vent, share your story, and help guide you to the proper outcome you need to stay healthy, right? And if you look at going for therapy or counseling, sometimes we all need somebody that's unbiased, that, what, am I on the right track? Is my process, is my thinking getting me to where I want to go? So it's kind of like coaching, but at a higher level because
Mm.
the therapists are trained in understanding mental health and potential diagnoses, or if you do have a mental health illness, you know, what other supports might you need to be successful and safe and productive? Because we're all human. And that's the thing. We're all human. Our bodies, our chemicals are changing. Critical incidents, trauma, conflicts, stressors impact our mental and physical, and you can't separate the two. And I
Mhm.
kind of like to break it down, like I've done suicide training. And when you think about it, if you're having heart pain, you go to the doctor because you might be having a heart attack. You get referred to the specialist who's the cardiac doctor. The heart is an organ. Our brain is an organ, just like the heart. So if you're having suicidal thoughts or not good thoughts, you're having a potential brain attack. And that brain attack, just like a heart attack, can kill you. So you go to the doctor and you get referred to the brain specialists, just like the heart specialists. Because without the brain or heart, we're not here. So we have to look after both.
Well, we only have a few minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Um, I'd like to share, just remember, be a part of creating that intergenerational conflict and trauma resiliency. Go identify your own resilient traits. Share with somebody what you actually, you know, their resilient traits, their strengths. Commend them, right? What did you learn from them? And this is something that when you can identify your own, you use it as a tool in your toolbox. It's a skill set. You do it with your partner, with your families. You start identifying your kids' resilient traits to help them manage that conflict in the early years. Let's create that leadership legacy internationally and intergenerationally.
And I guess not really, uh, how do I say this, aligning yourself or making yourself feel bad because you're not responding the same way someone else does.
Yeah.
Because you and I could experience the exact same thing at the exact same time and both respond a little bit differently,
Yeah.
right?
And that's like personally in the workplace, start engaging and learning more about what is psychological health and safety in the risk mitigation area that's under occupational health and safety, but then what is psychological safety in the context of the culture and being able to participate freely and bring forward ideas, bring forward conflict, bring forward failures to learn from it.
Yeah, I used to be a member of health and safety, and really all we would think about is, cords on the floor,
Yeah.
as an example. But I
Well,
think
ice.
COVID now, yeah,
Yeah.
I feel,
Or I use ice, right? Ice is a risk. The hazard is slip and fall. The potential outcome is nothing or it could be death. Well, when you look at workplace violence or harassment, the outcome can be nothing or it can be potential suicide. What does that do? What's the hazard of it? Mental health deterioration,
yeah,
psychological deterioration that comes into a mental health diagnosis condition that can impair somebody's everyday living and ability to work.
yeah,
So mental health and ICE, or ICE as the risk, and workplace violence and harassment as a risk, there is no difference. They're both risks and hazards that have to be mitigated.
yeah. And I think some organizations try to keep things separate if it's, if you're identifying ice or a cord on the floor, okay,
Yeah.
well, that's, yeah, whatever, you just move it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't get the same attention that it all should, because the outcome, as you say, can all end up being the same.
Yeah. And it's new. It's still new to Canada.
Yeah,
It's Bill or C-190 in the world. The World Health Organization and International Labor Code has recognized mental health in the workplace. It's legislation now in Australia. Canada has Bill C-65 and the provinces each have their own bill. So it is a worldwide topic that can't be ignored anymore. And that's where the opportunity of turning trauma into a resilient asset in our workplaces comes from starting to become curious about psychological health and safety in our workplaces.
yeah. And on that note, we've come to the end of today's show. Treena, thank you so much for talking about this. I really appreciate it. And I'm so glad that you're here to be able to share some of these experiences because, well, you've had quite the journey. from
Still
what
going.
you told
The
us.
journey's
Yeah, and
still
still
going.
going. Well, in a few years, we'll see what other new experiences you can share for us.
Yeah,
But thank you
there's
so much.
always the next time. There's always the next time.
Always. I really appreciate you sharing your time and talking about this today. And everyone watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody.
Thank you.
If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.